Morning, everyone. It's time to talk about sets. And this week in our fourth session, we move beyond the strife and disagreement exclusively within the Jewish community and moved into the realm of Christianity. We saw last week, we made reference to the 19th blessing of the Shemona Esrei, which was V'la Malshtinim, and about those who seem to be on the outs of the Jewish community, literally the informers, but all of the sectarians. And there had been this hypothesis that this was for Christians, and we saw that this is debated, that this was more likely, according to some, about within the Jewish community, those sects, whether it be Sadducees or Baisusim or the Essenes or other groups. But there does seem to be this idea that the Christians were this breakaway sect, and we are all, somewhat familiar with the idea Jesus is Jewish, and therefore the whole religion surrounding him emerged from Judaism, and some of his initial followers were Jewish, and the progression of Christianity historically is a fascinating subject which will emerge here, but it's certainly something that needs to be studied on its own. But we're going to look at how did Judaism look at Christianity. I wouldn't say necessarily how traditional Judaism looks at Christianity. We know Judaism is Judaism and Christianity is Christianity. It's separate religions, separate faith systems, and the like. But what does the Talmud say about Jesus? Are there any points of discussion as to what role Jesus' Judaism played in Christianity, or what were some of the ways that Jewish law responds to Christianity? Again, without recognizing that of course anything that's Christian is Judaism rejects. Right? We reject all the theological principles. We reject the ritual principles. Judaism looks at any other foreign worship as truly anathema, really toxic. Right? This is the idea of avodah zarah, idolatry. We'll touch upon as Christianity, idolatry, and certainly for a Jew to believe what a Christian believes is foreign. But we will take a look at all of these topics and related topics, or some of them at the very least. And I came across a blog post that kind of touches upon, what were Jews thinking about Christianity? Certainly throughout history, Judaism's impressions of Christianity are formed by the fact that, especially with the Christian anti-Semitism, certain theological anti-Semitism, Jews have borne the brunt of Christian wrath, the Crusades and the like. There were the famous disputations in the Middle Ages, very famously Ramban, Nachmanides, and Pablo Cristiani, as to the whole which religion is correct. And Pablo Cristiani was a Jew who converted to Christianity, who was using Jewish sources to try and prove the authenticity of Christianity. But yesterday, I came across a blog post by someone named Matt Osterklein. It's source number 1, and he writes a lot about music. It's Beyond the Music blog. And the title is A Tale of Three Schmoes, right? It's kind of like, it's not Larry, Mo, Larry, and Curly, those schmoes. But he talks about the schmoes in the Nemar tune that we often sing to the end, Aleinu. Nevertheless, there's a conspiracy theory which I can confirm is widely held by North American Jews, the Three Schmoes conspiracy. That is to say, the theory that the traditional melody for the end of the Aleinu prayer hides a secret concession to Christianity. This is how the story goes. The final line of Aleinu is, V'nemar v'yav Hashem l'melech b'yom hahu, Yashem echad u'shmo echad. God will rule, and his name will be one, and his kingdom will be one. In the melody, right, some of you are thinking in your heads now, what is it? V'nemar haya Hashem l'melech al kol haaretz b'yom hahu Yashem echad Ushemo, Ushemo, Ushemo Echad, which basically means 3 times is 1, right? So the traditional melody is transmitted orally over decades, repeats the penultimate word Ushmo 3 times, so the musical setting up conveys the sentence, and his name, and his name, and his name is 1. interpreting this liturgical word repetition as the implicit that addresses of three different divine entities. The hebraically oriented Jew sees with fear that this could be seen as an acknowledgement of the Trinity, the Christian conception of a triune God composed of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. This liturgical conspiracy founded on the assumption that the musical repetition of the word conveys Christian theological precepts is a fallacy, which reveals more about Jewish anxieties than anything else. We certainly know there's a lot of Jewish anxiety out there. But he goes through the whole blog, the whole history. He has all the music and how long the tune exists and everything like that, right? Some even don't. You don't have to go any further than Shema, right? Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem. The Lord, our God, the Lord is one, right? That's also the 3-1 fallacy. So I just find it interesting, just in terms of how we seem to be leaning into this Jewish Christian progression. Right? It's impossible to ignore Jesus is Jewish, but kind of in terms of are there, and this opens up all sorts of the Messianic Jews and Hebrew Christians and Jews for Jesus, right? So what do some traditional sources that in the Beit Midrash that we have right here, we will find a discussion of Jesus and how he was viewed. So that's the springboard. Happens to be a blog post that appeared just last week. What does the Talmud say about Jesus? So for the most part, you don't find very much, because there is the fact that the Talmud is censored. The interplay between Jews and Christians and Judaism and Christianity led to removing certain passages from the Talmud, and that leads so you could open up some Sanhedrin 43 and some versions of Sanhedrin 43, which is source number 2. You won't find anything about Christianity or Jesus, but they, if we compare manuscripts, we're able to identify and find some of the excised passages. In particular, Sanhedrin 43. The Mishnah teaches that a crier goes out before the condemned men. This is the part of the Talmud that's dealing with some of the 4 types of punishment, 4 executions that the Beit Din would issue on capital offenses. So the crier goes out before the condemned man. This indicates that it is only before him, while he's being led to his execution, that yes, the crier goes out. From the outset, before the accused is convicted, he does not go out. The Gemara raises a difficulty. But isn't it taught in a Braita that on Passover Eve they hung the corpse of Jesus the Nazarene after they killed him by way of stoning? And the crier went out before him for 40 days, publicly proclaiming Jesus the Nazarene is going out to be stoned, because he practiced sorcery, incited people to idol worship, and led the Jewish people astray. Anyone who knows of a reason to acquit him should come forward and teach it on his behalf. And the court did not find a reason to acquit him, so they stoned him and hung his corpse on Passover Eve. So they're discussing the law of when you announce an execution will take place. It's really only that day, right? But Jesus seemed to have a public announcement 40 days before, and this was done in order that anyone who had any exculpatory evidence would come forward and present it, so you wouldn't have to execute Jesus. So it's a few things emerge from this tradition. One, there was this execution of Jesus the rabbis are alluding to. Second, it's possible, it seems that they don't want him to be executed. If there's any way to avoid him being executed, they wanted that to be the case. And they wanted to maybe also show that they wanted him to stay alive, even though the Romans were executed. And there is this character of Jesus who's doing bad things from a Jewish perspective. Ula said, and how can you understand the proof? Was Jesus the Nazarene worthy of conducting a search for a reason to acquit him? He was an insider to idol worship. And God says with regard to an insider to idol worship, neither shall you spare, neither shall you conceal him. Rather, Jesus was different as he had close ties with the government. The Gentile authorities were interested in his acquittal. Consequently, the court gave him every opportunity to clear himself so that it could not be claimed that he was falsely convicted. After the trial of Jesus, the Gemara cites another brisa, and they talk about Jesus the Nazarene had 5 disciples: Matai, Nakai, Netzer, Buni, and Toda. It seems that there was also going on what's taking place over here, the court that's being trying to overturn the execution is the Jewish court, which would mean that the Jewish court was the one that issued the execution verdict, right? And it doesn't seem to be exactly happening with the Last Supper, although maybe that's taking place in the background. And that's if he was able to remain alive for the Last Supper because they gave him those extra 40 days. Again, I don't think we can really learn anything specific as the historicity of all of this, but the Sanhedrin is aware of Jesus, who has these disciples, who's doing things that border on the idolatrous, and there is a concern as to what executing him would mean and how that would be received by the Gentile community as a whole. Right? It doesn't have, the classic historical story of Jesus' execution, the way it's presented, is that the Romans killed him. He was a revolutionary, and that did not sit well. Also kind of the, without going into more detail, kind of the historical Jesus. And, one of the books, if you're looking for the historical Jesus, is entitled The Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus. It's by Reza Aslan. Jesus was more of a, we talked about Jewish sects last week. He was a Pharisee, right? He was someone who was more of a rabbinic Jew than an idolater. He had difficulty with the Sadducee, the Sadducee leadership at the time. And this is kind of like the aftermath of Tisha B'Av. You could see, if you are looking for kind of a historical presentation of some of these, of at least the Second Temple destruction period and the fighting that took place, the BBC has a series on the rise and fall of ancient Rome. And episode 4 is all about Judea. It's taking place post-Jesus, so that doesn't feature into it, but a lot of the sectarianism and some of the disputes can be found. You could probably find it on YouTube. I watched part of it on Tisha B'Av. But the Talmud is presenting Jesus as an enemy of Judaism, an idolater, an outlier, someone whose execution was going to be very problematic, controversial, and difficult. But Jesus' teachings were not stopped because he had disciples, only 5, not 12 or whatever. But there you have kind of a Talmudic Jesus. And a lot of the other sections that deal with Jesus aren't that many. You don't have a whole discussion. Generally present him in this type of a light, coming from a bit of a negative background, very who origin story is not very positive. He's often, as we will see, viewed as the student of Yehoshua ben Prachia, who ended up pushing him away. This is the Jesus of the Talmud. Questions, comments, reactions. He's there. It's not a big deal. They don't talk about him being Messiah. They don't talk about divinity. They don't talk about resurrection. A lot of this stuff is developing almost simultaneously at the same time as the Talmud is developing, so they're not necessarily even so aware of it, which is why we'll move into the medieval period. But questions, comments, reactions before we go forward. Okay, so in terms of, as Christianity itself matures as a religion, right, and even that is taking place, in the 4th and 5th century and the like. Of course, things become big, when Constantine converts to Christianity, and by then it becomes, a religion that's, that suffuses an empire and becomes theologically problematic for Jews and leads to anti-Semitism against Jews. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi summarizes some of the belief system of Christianity in his Kuzari, because the Kuzari, which is the king of the Khazar seeking the truth, he talks to a philosopher, he talks to a Christian, he talks to a Muslim, and then he finally talks to the Jew. And most of what we focus in the Kuzari is that conversation about Judaism. But first, he's interested in Christianity, so he asks the Christian to explain it to him. Source number 3, it's the opening section of the Kuzari. However, at the close of their history, in the last generation of the Jewish people, God became corporeal and transformed into a fetus in the body of a virgin from an important Jewish family, and she begot him. Seemingly a person, but secretly a God, seemingly a prophet, but secretly a God who dispatches prophets. He is the Messiah, whom we call the Son of God. He is the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. And behold, we are truly monotheists, although we speak of the Trinity. Right, so there's this already, we're not idolaters, we're just Trinitarians. And this is pretty much a very succinct definition of Christianity that Yehuda Halevi puts in his Kuzari. Now, the king is a little confused in response. Such a religion does not leave room for logic. Even more so, logic repels most of your words, right? This whole idea that, in general, the idea of Christianity doesn't really make sense. This idea that there's a God and a child, the virgin birth, resurrection, again, Yehuda Halevi is not interested in defending Christianity at all, but we are seeing how Jews are viewing and summarizing and presenting the Christian beliefs as recognizing the Jesus character and the Trinity and the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, and essentially this makes no sense. That's how Yehuda Halevi presents it. Rambam is also aware of Christianity. He's in Egypt. Remember, Rambam is a bit of slightly later than Yehuda Halevi. Yehuda Halevi is late 11th, early 12th, and the Rambam lives 1135 to 1205. Right? They never they never overlapped or interacted or met or anything. And the Rambam also has been the subject of discussion in terms of the text, different manuscripts, different edited editions, different censored editions. And source number 4 from chapter 11, Hilchos Malachim, is a more completed version that has some of what's censored out. Because the Rambam is going to start talking about Christianity and other religions, and he does so within the context of Mashiach. The Rambam says, who's Mashiach? If a king will arise from the house of David, who diligently contemplates the Torah and observes its mitzvot as described by the written law and the oral law, as David his ancestor, will compile all of Israel to walk in the way of Torah and rectify the breaches of its observance and to fight the wars of God, we may with assurance consider him Mashiach. Right, so Mashiach's going to come from the house of David. It's going to be about the written law and the oral law. It's going to lead all the Jews to observance. If he did not succeed to this degree, right, if he's not finished in the job, he didn't build the temple, he didn't ingather the exiles. If he didn't succeed, he was surely is not the Redeemer promised by the Torah. Right? If you die, you can't be Mashiach. Rather, you should be considered as all the other proper and complete kings of the Davidic dynasty who died. Right? There are those who did not achieve. Jesus of Nazareth, who aspired to be the Mashiach and was executed by the court, was also alluded to in Daniel's prophecies. He says, Jesus can be a significant personage who may even be referenced in the Daniel, book of Daniel. The vulgar among your people shall exalt themselves in an attempt to fulfill the vision, but they shall stumble. Right? It's going to be possible that there will be a wayward Jew who will try to be Mashiach but will fail. That's Jesus, Rambam says. Can there be a greater stumbling block than Christianity? All the prophets spoke of Mashiach as the Redeemer of Israel and the Savior who would gather the dispersed and strengthen their observance of the mitzvot. Right? The whole purpose of Mashiach is a religious revival, a Jewish religious revival. In contrast, Christianity caused the Jews to be slain by the sword, their remnants to be scattered and humbled, the Torah to be altered, and the majority of the world to err and serve a God other than the Lord. All right, so we can see that Rambam is not a big fan of Christianity. Nevertheless, the intent of the creator of the world is not within the power of man to comprehend. We can't understand God's ways, for his ways are not our ways, nor his thoughts our thoughts. Ultimately, all the deeds of Jesus of Nazareth and that Ishmaelite who arose after him, Muhammad, will only serve to prepare the way for Mashiach's coming and the improving of the entire world, motivating the nations to serve God. As Stephania states, I'll transform the peoples to a pure language. They'll call upon the name of God and serve him with one purpose. Christianity and Islam are part of the continuum of humanity's progress towards being better. How will this come about? The entire world has already become filled with the mention of Mashiach, Torah, and mitzvot. People are talking about the idea of a Messiah or religion. These matters have been spread to the furthermost islands to many stubborn-hearted nations. They discuss these matters in the mitzvot of the Torah, saying these mitzvot were true, but were only negated in the present age and not applicable for all time. The fact that they talk about them and then reject them at least means that they're talking about them. Others say implied in the mitzvot are hidden concepts that cannot be understood simply. Mashiach has already come, revealed these hidden truths. Right? They say that the Christianity is the inner meaning of the mitzvot that Jesus came and revealed. When the true Messianic king will arise and prove successful, his position becoming exalted and uplifted, they will all return and realize that their ancestors endowed them with a false heritage, their prophets and ancestors caused them to err, and they will all, those billions and billions will recant and recognize that they have been sold a bill of goods. So there you have the this idea of the Rambam, although not necessarily that familiar directly with Christianity because he is living in Egypt, but recognizing that it emerged as a movement trying to say it was a messianic redemptive movement. He pushes back. It's not. It's terrible. It's the opposite. But there's a positive in the other religions. Jesus and that other guy who came later, the Ishmaelite. That is the Rambam on Christianity. Again, not summarizing the theological positions or saying that they're wrong, like Halevi did, but showing yes, they're wrong, and maybe there's a silver lining to these religions in the world. What about Jesus? Who was the Jesus of the Talmud? Did anyone ever talk about that? Right? We see he's Yeshu HaNotzri, Jesus the Nazarene. We saw the source in Sanhedrin. We reference other sources. So Shimon ben Semach Duran, known as the Tashbates or the Rashbates, who was living in Spain, Catholic Spain, Inquisition era Spain, really, before the expulsion. So he writes about this, and he's writing that he heard from the Tosafis. The Tosafis lived in the 200 years before him in the Rhineland under Christianity. They were the ones who we know suffered under the Crusaders. Source number 5. I heard that the Tosafis wrote, and I saw in the polemic Rabbi Chil, the son of Rabbi Yosef the Frenchman, Rabbi Chil of Paris, one of the famous Baalei Tosfos, that Jesus, the Christian of whom our sages spoke, who lived in the time of Rabbi Yeshua, son of Prachia, was not the one of whom Christians spoke in their scriptures. Rather, he's the one mentioned in the Talmud chapter Arba Misos. He's the one that we read about in Sanhedrin. They prepared witnesses for him, and his name was the son of Pandira. He's referred to as Pandira. And they said of Jesus, he was hung on the eve of Passover, as they said of the son of Satadai. Right, so there's different names that are that the Talmud uses as historical Jesus. When they saw that Jesus Nazareth said that he did not come to nullify the Torah, but rather to strengthen it, they found fruit from his words that he nullified the Torah. See, he's invoking a teaching of Jesus and saying it could be that Jesus actually did come to strengthen it, but they found proof to go in the other direction. The all-encompassing response to the fraudulent Pauline doctrine is Torah speaks plainly and not in riddles. And then he goes off to discuss that Christianity, kind of as we know it, really there was a major shift in the Christianity away from Jesus to his disciples, in particular Paul. And that is the Christianity that became more known and more widespread in his times and in ours. And it's the idea that it would say that the law, the Torah wasn't there to be taken literally, and the Rav Shimon ben Semach is saying yes, it is, right. Keep the Sabbath is keep the Sabbath. The laws of the Sabbath, the laws of the Sabbath. It's not just the spirit of the law; it's the letter of the law. And so we see that there is this direct Jewish addressing of this idea of Jesus. And Tashbates seems to recognize that there is a historical Jesus that we can understand, and the Talmud does describe, and there was a problematic element to that historical Jesus. That's not necessarily the Jesus that then inspired Christianity. Those teachings emerged from his disciples, and he puts in a special, specific emphasis on Paul, which in Christian history and analysis matches up in terms of the widespread nature of the church after Jesus's death. Very much was not. Jesus did not create the Christian religion because Jesus died. And even if you're Christian, you have a whole faith system based upon who Jesus was and what happened after he died. That wasn't him. That was his disciples using his words. And you get into, that's why I mentioned Reza Aslan's book. The Zealot really traces the historical Jesus and the original disciples in Jerusalem, the church in Rome, and how Paul spread that church in Rome. And we're going to come back to that in just a little bit. So you have this understanding, of a historical Jesus. You have certainly a dismissive attitude towards Christian theology. We see that in Yehuda Halevi. We see it being dismissed by Rambam, who opens up a silver lining towards Christianity and Islam as religions that can make people better. And you have kind of the recognition from Tashbates and Source 5 that there is a Jesus. There's a character Jesus who's kind of on the outs and on the periphery of the Jewish traditional Judaism, not necessarily the same Jesus that creates Christianity, which goes in a separate direction. Just source number 6 in terms of some of the spiritual, some of the teachings of Christianity not being as blatantly rejected. So there's the character of Leon Medena, Rabbi Yehuda Aryalev Medena in Venice. And so there's a biography of him by Yaakov Dweck. And in his introduction, he talks about Medena rejecting Kabbalah. He was not a fan of Kabbalah. And he confronted Kabbalah as a vital force in Jewish life, and he criticized Kabbalah to diminish its status, not to destroy it. Right? He was not a fan of the Jewish mystical wisdom. And one of the things he points out is that about the Kabbalists maintain the belief in the Sefirot, considered a crucial element of the Jewish faith, and branded as heretics anyone who denied their centrality to Judaism. This is the idea that there are 10 emanations, 10 ways that God is understood in this world, and there's all sorts of combinations and permutations of that. Medena repudiated this claim and leveled a severe countercharge of his own after an examination of the Sefirot concept, concluded that it pointed to a plurality within God similar to the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. Right, the idea that if you're talking about God having multiple ways of being expressed, he thinks this is a little bit too Christian. Right, going back to Ushmo, 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 and so there was this understanding of the development of Christianity, and there were those who felt that certain aspects of Judaism, and again the whole interplay between Kabbalah and Christianity, and how Kabbalah develops and the like is a very large and separate discussion religiously and academically. But you see that there's this a little bit of the recognizing, their Trinitarian impulses. There may be some similarity in the Kabbalistic Sephardic impulses. Rav Kook, who's writing in the turn of the 20th century about faith, and Rav Kook, who tries to kind of create a holistic spiritual philosophy. Source 7, the essence of heresy is the separation of the concept of fear of heaven and the principle of closeness to God from the light of Torah in all its operative manifestations. So heresy is when you remove faith from Torah. As a result of this separation, which was performed maliciously from within the Jewish nation, right? That happened with Christianity. It started from when essentially they tore off the Torah from the soul. The world became polluted. Pagan impurity found a foothold and a source of sustenance till the end of days, when the drying of its branches they will break. And the separation of the principle of fear of God from the observance of the Torah grew to the point that separation alone did not suffice. Rather, this poisonous idea reached a level of contradiction to the extent that the evil maidservant dared to conclude that a fraudulent concept of fear was the real one, and that necessitated the nullification, destruction, the observance of the Torah in its study. Right? The main point, the ikr became the tafel, and the tafel became the ikr. The main point of Torah was cast to the side. The focus just was on faith and belief, and that is what true heresy is, and that is Rav Kook's description of Christianity. Questions, comments, or thoughts before we pivot into kind of a Jewish legal understanding of so what is exactly is the status of Christianity?
Sorry, just the name of that woman and her book. So sorry to interrupt.
Oh, Reza Aslan, it's a man. It's called The Zealot.
Mm-hmm.
Aslan is the Reza, Reza.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm just interested in what the Kuzari said and what the Rambam seemed to imply, that Christianity is not logical. Like, what about religion is logical? It's all based on faith. Is creation? We live in an Orthodox world. We all believe God created Eser Mamaros and all that stuff, but there's nothing logical about it at all.
Well, I guess it depends on how you define logic, right? The Kuzari would say it's based on a national revelation that we all heard it, and that would be the lane that he occupies. And for Rambam, it's about knowledge. And it's about the intellect, and the more you drill down into it, the more you will find out that it makes sense. I would imagine this idea of a Trinity and a Immaculate Conception and the like makes very little sense the more you drill down to it.
Yeah, okay.
But I think that would be the contrast that the two of them would draw.
Okay, that's a good approach. Thanks.
So as we said at the beginning, and it's no surprise that Judaism views Christianity as false, right? It's the essence of heresy in Rav Kook. It's forbidden and the like. But is it idolatrous? right? And that's something that has certainly shifted throughout the Jewish history. But already in medieval times, those Jews living most amongst Christians felt that it wasn't necessarily as idolatrous as bowing down to mountains and trees. So the Tosfot in Sanhedrin raises a view that becomes prominent in certainly the Ashkenazi communities, whether it be later articulated in one way, one form or another by the Meiri or Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, that the problem of Christianity is probably Christian theology is problematic for Jews, but not for non-Jews. And the springboard of that discussion is with regard to taking an oath, and that if you take an oath, you're taking God's name, and that's what we said. We counted the 10 Commandments on Shabbos just recently, right? You can't take God's name in vain. So if you take an oath, it has to be true, and if not, you've taken God's name in vain. So what about if a Jew and a non-Jew are doing business and they're going to have to take an oath, and therefore you're going to have the non-Jew take an oath by his religion, which is idolatrous, and therefore you're, in a sense, pushing the non-Jew to worship idols. So Tosfot in Sanhedrin source 8, it is permissible to cause a Gentile's oath through litigation with one's Jewish, non-Jewish partner, because today all swear in the name of the saints to whom no divinity is ascribed. When they take an oath, they're not swearing to a God, they're taking an oath to a saint. Even though they also mention God's name and have in mind another thing. And even no idolatrous name is actually said. They've also said they've had the creator of the world in mind, right? They think of God as creator. Even though they associate they partner God's name with something else, we do not find that it's forbidden to cause others to associate, and there is no issue of placing a stumbling block before the blind by entering into litigation with the non-Jewish business partner that he takes an oath, because Noachites are not warned about it. Basically, Tosfot says that this idea that Christians have of a shituf, of a partnership, trinity, that's not idolatry. It would be for a Jew, but it's not idolatry for a non-Jew. And this opens up a whole series of discussions. Not everyone embraces it as fully. The Meiri definitely does. This impacts how we look at any area of Jewish law that distinguishes between Jew and non-Jew. Usually it's distinguishing between Jew and idolater. And if Christians are not idolaters, then you can't just say that they're not Jewish. So you have this idea that all of a sudden, remember, we're talking about how Judaism looks at Christianity. You see how Judaism looked at Jesus and the rise of Christianity. And now we're seeing that Christianity as a whole, this very much, is in line with what the Rambam was introducing, this idea that there's some good qualities also to Christianity. There's some idolatrous tendencies that would be idolatrous if practiced by a Jew, but not by a non-Jew. And, really this, I think, we'll finish by looking at kind of this split in terms of, does Judaism say anything about the development of Christianity? There's a Jesus character. He wasn't good. He was leading things in the wrong direction. There was a whole Christianity, which clearly is not fit in with traditional Judaism. It doesn't make as much sense. Jesus could not have been the Messiah. And this is, as Rav Kook says, this is this is spiritual darkness and heresy. At the same time, there's a certain accommodationist tendency that, non-Jews don't have to believe exactly the way we do. So the fact that Judaism and Christianity split is a big part of how we Jews look at Christianity. And here there's a very interesting theory that is advanced in a couple of different ways, as to maybe there was some Jewish influence in turning Christianity Christian. Remember, Jesus was Jewish. He could have been a traditional Jew. He was a rabbinic Jew. He could have been, very much. He clearly wanted to make changes. He clearly wanted to have a social justice revolution. He clearly didn't like the Romans. He didn't like the elite, who seemed to be taking advantage of the common man in the temple hierarchy. But he may have had visions of grandeur. Thought messianic. He wouldn't have been. He's definitely not the last Jew to think that they were Mashiach and be proven wrong. But where did this idea of Christianity being so different, the Trinity and the Immaculate Conception and some of the other what becomes their gospels and their way of life and their rituals. So there seems to be a suggestion that Jews may have pushed Christians over the edge a little bit. And so the Shulchan Aruch mentions that there are days that we fast, that had been fast days that aren't really on our calendar anymore. Right? These are the days when troubles occurred for our forefathers. It was worthy to fast on them. On the 8th of Teves, the Torah was written in Greek during the days of King Ptolemy, and darkness descended on the world for 3 days. On the 9th, it's not known who caused the trouble that happened on it. So it seems that not only the 10th of Teves was a fast day, but the 8th and 9th were also fast days. The 8th, because of the translation of the Torah into Greek, which I think we've spoken about before, and the 9th was a fast day, but we don't know why. So, this idea of the 9th day of Teves being a bad day. So Rabbi Avram Bar Chia, who was living in Spain, late 11th, 12th century, he thinks that Nolad HaNotzri, Tes Teves. He thinks that maybe that's when Jesus was born, right? And he talks about the Chaf He Yom L'Chodesh Decemberi, Hu Tarach Romi, born on the 25th day of December. And this was, this was in the year 32. This was in the year, this would have been in the year, it would have been in the year, we talk about the year 5761. It would have been the year 5761, 2 millennia ago, right? So somehow I think it would have been the year 1 of the Common Era, which is an interesting discussion because what year was Jesus born? Right? I think Jesus was born in the year 0. No, it would be the year 1. But actually, historically, I think Christianity believes it was the year 3. You think sometimes the Jewish calendar is messed up, and figuring out the year of Jesus' birth is also complicated. And he says that this, but then he goes on to say that this was but he says. He says this doesn't really make any sense. You can't know. He says the 25th of December was a pagan day beforehand. It's not a good day, but it became associated with Jesus. So the 25th of December became associated as a bad day in the Jewish calendar. But it seems that they were talking about a kind of a Christian connection to the 9th of Teves. Mishnah Berurah says, no, it was the yurtzeit of Ezra HaSofer. It's a Jewish yurtzeit. So it's either a Jewish yurtzeit or maybe it's Jesus' birthday. But that's not so simply, and it's not so necessarily understood. But Rabbi Baruch Frankel found, source 12 says, I found in a manuscript that the 9th of Teves, Shimon HaKalfus, who helped save the Jewish people from a great tragedy, died, and the sages established it as a day of fasting in Jerusalem. So, we're now talking about a Shimon HaKalfus, and who's Shimon HaKalfus? So, there's a work called Toldot Yeshu, the Chronicles of Jesus, and it's not clear exactly its authorship, or this goes back, to trace this back to the 4th or 5th century. There are different versions, and so the passage that we have here in source 13 is probably more of a synopsis than a translation, and you can go online and find full versions and the like. This was I found I found several versions of this snippet in some way online, but we're trying to understand who's this Shimon HaKalfus. So the sages desired to separate from Israel those who continue to claim Yeshua as the Messiah. Right? Why were the people? Jesus died. And he has his followers who are claiming he's still Messiah. The sages we got to push this Shita out of the Jewish community, and we have to, especially remember, when Jesus had died, there were no Christians yet. These were all Jews who followed Jesus. So the rabbis are trying to move the Jewish followers of Jesus away from the mainstream community. So they called upon a greatly learned man, Simeon Kepha. Shimon Kalfus, Simeon Kepha. Simon went to Antioch, the main city of the Nazarenes, and proclaimed to them, I am the disciple of Yeshua. He sent me to show you the way. I'll give you a sign as Yeshua has done. Simeon added that Yeshua desired that they separate themselves from the Jews and no longer follow their practices. They were now free to observe the first day of the week instead of the 7th, right? So basically, Shimon is sent as to rile up the followers of Jesus and get them to be less Jewish. Right? You don't have to. You're gonna have the Sunday instead of Saturday, the resurrection instead of Passover, the ascension to heaven instead of the Feast of Weeks, the finding of the cross instead of the New Year, the Feast of the Circumcision instead of the Day of Atonement, the New Year instead of Hanukkah. They were to be indifferent with regard to circumcision and the dietary laws. Don't do bris milah. Don't keep kosher. Also, they were to follow the teaching of turning the right if smitten on the left and the meek acceptance of suffering. All these new orders of Shimon Kefa, or Paul, as he was known to Nazarenes, thought they were really meant to separate those Nazarenes from the people of Israel to bring internal strife to an end. A certain tradition that there were Jews who pushed the followers of Jesus towards Christianity. And there's a Dikduke Sofrim, which collects some of the different versions of the Rishonim that quotes Rashi as saying, and this is source number 14, Dikduke Sofrim of Avodah Zarah, that's quoting Rashi. The Gemara states that all the writings and language of the nations is not from them. This means that all their books of heresy, Yochanan Paulus and Petrus, who were Jews, wrote. They purposely infected their culture in order to sway Christian faith away from Judaism. They themselves were not heretics, as they did so for the benefit of the Jewish people, as written in the book Taliyah Yeshu, that source 13 that we see above. So there seems to be the possibility that this 9th of Teves was commemorating the yahrzeit of the Jewish secret agent provocateur who pushed the Jewish followers of Jesus into Christianity to separate the faiths, to remove the lingering Christian influence on the Jewish people. And source number 15, which is from Rabbi Beryl Wein, he summarizes, and the lecture is also there, a lecture by Professor Schneur Lyman, right, and who speaks about this in particular. And he proposed that based upon the recurring Jewish legends about the possibility of there being Jewish popes in the early years of Christianity, and the fact that the rabbis at the time of the mission considered all their efforts to delineate Judaism as a religion completely separate and distinct from nascent Christianity, the rabbis placed one of their own colleagues as a mole into the hierarchy of the church to ensure it would completely separate itself from the Jewish people and Judaism per se. This person naturally was awarded the cover of anonymity by the rabbis, and his mission was most successful, as Christianity early on did separate itself completely from Jews and Judaism. Various names have been submitted. I remember Professor Lyman chose a likely candidate. I don't no longer recall who he was. This anonymous hero of the rabbis, the Jewish people, died on the 9th of Teves, is remembered, albeit anonymously, by the cryptic reference to that day in the Code of Jewish Law. Right, so Rabbi Wein heard the lecture, which you can listen to the whole lecture also. He doesn't remember who it was, but it was Shimon HaKalfa, Sami, and Kefa, who was the secret agent. And that is how Judaism sees that Christianity really started off as within the tent with some idiosyncrasies, but recognized that those idiosyncrasies would lead Jews farther astray. So they essentially moved Christianity farther away from Judaism, making it incompatible with Judaism, and making it something completely, as Rabbi Yehuda Levi said, illogical, completely that would be antinomian, completely that would be even bordering on idolatrous to keep the Jews away. Sounds like it could be a good a movie. If they made it, sounds like something like Da Vinci Code, Angels and Demons. That guy, he could write a book about this. But so we see that in terms of Jews and Christians, we have certain sources that recognize the person of Jesus, the development of Christianity, it's being completely different than Judaism, whether it be technical, political, spiritual. In the way of Rav Kook, we see that there's a certain accommodationist strand that doesn't look at Christians as idolaters, even if Christianity is idolatry. And that very difference may have been encouraged or facilitated by Jews themselves. Why we would want to, create the religion of, billions who hate us, I'm not sure, that could be a separate conversation. But there is this linkage in a discussion of Jews and Christians without, talking all about the theology and the different practices of how Judaism looked at it. And as we said at the beginning, if you sing Aleinu and you shmo, shmo, shmo it, that doesn't mean you're a secret Trinitarian. But there is something to be said about the Jewish origins of Christianity and how it went very far afield. And we looked at some of the sources and ideas. Happy to take any questions, comments, or final thoughts.
Very interesting.